Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a 6-day frontline update for the 28th of July 2025. There's a lot of change to frontline, being 6 days in the making, and the Russians are pushing in an awful lot of places. Although it's quite interesting, the Ukrainians are pushing back in a few of these. We're going to start up in the north. Quite a lot going on in the north in general. Obviously, Tetkino here and Kindrativka and the Sumy area. Also, you've got Kharkiv, the two sectors there, and another one that broke out in a place called Milove over here, where actually the commander of the Russians was killed recently, as I reported the other day. And then quite a lot of activity going on the Kupiansk front line now. So we'll start up in Sumy. And we'll go straight to Tetkino here, where the Russians are pushing back east of the town of Tetkino. The Ukrainians have been hitting the Russians here with some guided glide bombs, but essentially there is no significant change in the urban area of Tetkino itself, but it's to the east around these water treatment facilities here where the Russians are pushing back. As you can see, that's where Andrew Perpetua had the previous Russian defensive line. They've now pushed almost to the border, in part of this area. So yeah, Tetkino has been somewhere where I was expecting the Russians to have been pushed out. They were really struggling there under the Kosh with only this supply road that was under fire control, where they were able to adequately, or where they were hoping to supply their troops, and that was really difficult for them to do so. But they seem to have held on, and the Ukrainians have been unable to push the Russians further out of Tetkino. So that's what's going on there. I don't know why my zoom goes in and out. Apologies there, make you a bit dizzy. A bit to the east, we look at Novi Put. It's a tiny sort of settlement. Really, a couple of houses, can't even see the houses on the map. But this is Novi Put, which is a set of trees and roads just north of the border where the Ukrainians have pushed in previously. Then they were pushed back out by the Russians. Now, even according to Suret maps, the Russians pushed a little bit north of the border there. So the Ukrainians are putting some effort into that area, I guess, to give the Russians something to think about all along here. Possibly allowing the Ukrainians to push further to the north and help out with Tetkino, but no real significant gains there. And then really it's Kindrativka, Andriivka, Oleksivka, where there's a lot of activity going on at the moment. Ukraine is having some success here. We'll go to Grayskull here a couple of days ago, saying the 225th, I have their patch just there. Which you can't see. 225th Motorized Rifle Battalion liberating Kindrativka. The Russians lost 3 battalions and 1 battalion commander there. It has been bad for the Russians. They've had received a real bloody nose there. Visionaire here saying, when was this? Just actually 3 days ago now, 2.5 days ago. 3 days. Russian military journalists, particularly the Severny Canal, report that Ukrainian forces have managed to turn the tide in Sumy region. Kindrativka, its approaches and the surrounding perimeter have been completely liberated by the Ukrainians. The report also notes the fate of the Russian group encircled near Kindrativka remains unclear, but it's likely tragic. So I reported a bunch of different Telegram channels reporting disaster for the Russians there. Ukrainians have also achieved access to Unikivka, where Russian forces were forced to abandon several strongholds. Ukrainian troops now control about half of the settlement. Additionally, in Bezalivka, Ukrainian forces have regained access to the state border, which is interesting because Bezalivka is back over here. So that's where we have Andrew Perpetua showing the Russians have regained that, but actually south of the border, this is in line with what Andrew Perpetua is saying. This is the Russian control is kind of north of the border to a degree, just around there. Suret Maps has the Bezalivka under the control of the Russians. I don't think that is the case, and that's what Vision is saying there. And then as we come over to here, we have Unikivka. There's fighting there. We have Oleksivka. The Russians seem to be, well, the Ukrainians might well have pushed the Russians into kind of this road coming down here. They could be fighting up and down that road. so although both mappers have that under Russian control, and then Kindrativka further to the west, and Drivka as well, pressure there. So the Ukrainians, in fact, well, we'll come on to that in a second. There is the idea that they're a little bit further north, possibly, than we were thinking. So a Russian unit of 10 soldiers has been filmed prior to being eliminated north of Kindrativka, Sumy region, using combination FPV drones and artillery strikes. So those soldiers just north of Kindrativka, that's Kindrativka. Don't know exactly where, but it's going to be somewhere around here, where apparently they were unable to be seen due to fog, I think, and then suddenly popped up and were taken out by the Ukrainians. Now, the 225th, as mentioned, have taken control of the heights north of Andrivka here. So this is what I'm talking about, possibly a little bit north between Kindrativka and Andrivka. So that's somewhere around here, the Ukrainians controlling the heights. That's good news. Just trying to see, you've got the road coming down there. So just, yeah, not too sure. That might even be in this grey zone where they've taken control. But we shall see. Anyway, they are making some gains there, so that's decent. In the northwest of Andrivka village, southern Zolotarivsky forest, northern Sumy region. So that's good. And then we hear that Ukrainian fighters from the 425th is this Milove. So this is now going to Milove. We'll come to that in a second. So a lot of fighting going on around here. It is thought that Andrivka and Oleksivka are really under a lot of pressure. They could be fighting, as I mentioned, in Oleksivka, but also some of these other settlements there might be some pressure being put all over this front by the Ukrainians. They have, according to some of the Russians complaining about what happened in Kindrativka, the Ukrainians have loaded in an awful lot of reserves into this area. Take that claim with a pinch of salt. But it could be that they are favouring this sector as one that first of all, they need to get the Russians away from Sumy, and they need to take back, they would like to take back all their land up to the border so that they don't have to use that as some kind of, in the negotiations, that the Russians won't use it as bargaining chip. Of course, they have these two areas in the northern Kharkiv Oblast area. Surat map saying that Russians made some tiny gains on the easternmost point of the Vovchansk sector. But it's over here in Milove where the Russians sort of randomly did this attack over the border and have had some success. There are claims that the Russian leader for the unit that's there has been eliminated. Ukrainian fighters from the 425th Separate Assault Battalion are eliminating occupiers in Milove, Kharkiv region. The exact situation in the area is still being clarified, says N-Strike. So it could be that there is some success for the Ukrainians in pushing the Russians out of there, but much yet to be confirmed there. Now, worrying for the Ukrainians around Kupiansk, because there are claims that the Russians are making some advances just north of the city. As you can see, Surat Maps has a really charitable interpretation of what's going on there. It might well be that there is, as you can see from Andrew Perpetua's map, it's a much thinner area of actual control that the Russians have. That's probably more accurate. As you can see here from this map, there is activity in this grey zone. This is what Surat Maps has a tendency to do, is interpret grey zones as Russian control. As soon as there's fighting there, because there are Russians there, even if they are there and then killed, and then there are no Russians there, that is controlled by the Russians. That's how Surat Maps does his mapping. Anyway, the situation in Kupiansk direction is becoming more difficult, said N-Strike today. Russian infantry have already been spotted in the forested areas east of Kindrativka. So that is here. So forested areas there. I presume that's what's meant. That's certainly worrying. And that would certainly mean that that is a grey zone now. They are also assaulting Moskovka. So Moskovka is... actually, where is Moskovka? Oh, yes. So, so assaulting this general area. That's the northern part of Kupiansk itself. So really are getting very close to Kupiansk. and this is worrying for the Ukrainians. It remains in a grey zone for now. There's no established control, but the enemy is actively trying to gain a foothold. Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups, the DRG, deep reconnaissance groups, are now frequently infiltrating the city. So really, it wasn't expecting this. Kupiansk is possibly starting to become a little bit like Prokovsk down to the south. So this is something that's really developed over the last week or two, and the Russians really challenging that northern part of the city, deeply worrying there. Tatargami says, as of today, Russian forces are pressing towards Kupiansk from the northwest, advancing through Moskovka in the direction of Sobolivka. Despite early failures to advance from Radkivka, Russian forces appear to have shifted focus, opting to flank the city from the west. So this is the new vector for them, attacking down in this direction rather than fully from the north here from Radkivka, but actually coming around possibly through Moskovka from the northwest. Definitely a concern for the Ukrainians there, as the Russians gaining more momentum. And then we're going to come to right down, actually not to the Serebryansky forest yet, that's the last one on there. We're going to come down to the Kremina area, just north of Kremina, in the Torska and Terny area. But first, you can see Surat Maps has some gains for the Russians in that pocket around this Pischany area, and we have some gains for the Russians around Zeleny High, further to the south, where they've just south of where they've got to the Oskil River. No change around this sector, which is good news for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have been pushing back here, pushing the Russians back just north of Lazova, keeping this pocket active. But according to Surat Maps, some gains for the Russians just south of there. And then further to the south here, so we have around Rakivka. This is essentially what I call the Torska Terny area, but actually it really isn't the area of Torska. It's right down here, and Terny's over here, and I don't quite know what to call it, but it's going for the Oskil River, moving ever steadily westwards. I say that, but actually the Ukrainians might have been successful in pushing the Russians back. So Andrew Perpetua, these lighter blue areas signify where the Russian defensive line has been pushed back. Tiny bit up there, tiny bit over here at Rydkadub, where the Ukrainians have previously been pushing quite a lot. It seemed quite I don't know if dangerous is the right word, but according to, say, Surat Maps, where the Russians control north and south, and the Ukrainians pushed quite deep through Rydkadub all the way to back here towards Katinivka here, that seemed to be very dangerous, and they were kind of surrounded on three sides. Now, according to Surat Maps, the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians back there, but Andrew Perpetua has the Ukrainians having some success in Rydkadub. But then on this section around Karpivka, we've talked about this last couple of mapping updates. The Ukrainians do seem to be stopping the Russians here and actually pushing them back. So here we say the AFU counterattacked and advanced west of Lipove. So there you go. There's Karpivka up there, if you like, around here, Lipove. So some success all around here, really, as according to Grayskull there. So large areas where the Ukrainians have had some success. Also, not just here, but up over here. So that area could have seen some success for the Ukrainians. If we come to another source, N-Strike here saying, as a result of successful counterattacks, the armed forces of Ukraine have expanded the control zone near the village of Karpivka in Donetsk, including the outskirts of the settlements and forest belts. So really good news there. There's that long area where they've got between the Russians, not indicating that the Russians are taking any land back there as per Surat Maps that we were just discussing, but certainly further to the south here, the Ukrainians having some success, according to a few people. Visioner says a death zone. In fact, this is actually a chap called Arty Green. He was an artillery commander. I don't know what he's doing now, but he's been really useful source throughout the war. Quite forthright, doesn't mince his words, tells you how it is. Quote, a death zone has been established for the Russians in the Beletsky line of the 3rd Army Corps of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, he said. That's Arty Green in an interview with Feldman. Quote, in the direction of Liman, the occupiers have some territorial successes, but they pay a very high price for it thanks to the green zone. Their infantry assaults near Borova are carried out on foot, but there stands a strong third corps that destroys them on an individual scale. So this is slightly further to north. I think he's talking about quite a few areas here possibly, but that's a Borova area. So he could well be saying that they're making some gains there, but at a huge cost. But that could be relevant for all of this general area. He continues, this entire area is a death zone. The Russians die here. They want to advance to achieve some success to receive some orders from Russian generals. The configuration does not worry me. On the contrary, such a large zone requires a constant enemy replenishment, so let them replenish, Green noted. According to him, the Third Corps is currently the only newly formed corps that actively holds the front line. The regrouping of other units is delayed due to military bureaucracy. There is a whole reorganization of the army into these different corps, and so the Third Corps apparently is the only one that's presently fighting on the front line. That's potentially good news for the Ukrainians. They've got newly organized units that they can rotate into the front line, so that may be what's underwriting people's thoughts occasionally that the Ukrainians could mount a counteroffensive. I don't know that they can do any wide-scale attacking, really. The Ukrainians being pushed back in a number of small places all the way to the Serebryansky forest. And as you can see here, Surrey Maps has the Ukrainians pushing the Russians back into Dobrova. Goodness me, I remember talking a lot about Dobrova when it was all fighting around this forest and north of the forest as the Ukrainians pushed towards Crimea. Never quite happened in the end, but there was, Dobrova was at one stage under Ukrainian control, certainly in a grey zone. Now we have the Ukrainians having some success to the south of Dobrova. So that's good news there in the Serebryansky forest. Right, then we're going to come down further to the south in the direction of Siversk. So in the Serebryansky forest, there's a tiny bit of gain. Well, actually fairly considerable if Surrey Maps is to be believed, right through into the middle along one of these sort of tributaries maybe, or along some of those oxbow lakes of the Siversky Donetsk River area. We have no change to the mappers on the map today for this area, but it appears there's quite a lot of fighting around the eastern areas of Siversk. The Ukrainians have been pushed back in Kamianske, the Russians pushing forward and getting ever closer to Siversk. So let's have a look at Siversk and what's happening there. As you can see here, the Russians pushing against Siversk, but the Ukrainians pushing back. Big news said Vizhina on the 22nd, so a couple of days ago. Russian forces attempted a large-scale mechanized assault on the Donetsk front in the Siversk direction, including tanks, IFVs, APCs, motorcycles and buggies. Really pushed hard here. The armed forces of Ukraine detected the enemy movement, launched a counter-strike using artillery, aviation and FPV drones, successfully destroying the main Russian strike vanguard. At this moment, clearing and neutralization of the remaining Russian units is ongoing. And indeed, quite a few people talking about this. This is all being geolocated in that grey zone just sitting to the east of Siversk. So you've got Siversk there, Kamianske, and just north of that sort of lake area. So just around here, there was a massive attack. We'll talk about what massive means these days. But Russian forces attempted to break through from Kamianske with 6 tanks, 3 APCs, 6 MTLBs, 1 armoured recovery vehicle, 12 light armoured vehicles, 2 buggies and 41 motorcycles. Although the assault was eventually repelled, the Russian troops managed to advance fairly deep before being pushed back. So really close to Siversk there, but then they were ultimately pushed back. But that is worrying. However, they lost a lot of kit. So, Ukrainian forces from the 54th Mechanized and 81st Air Mobile Brigades repelled a massive Russian mechanized assault on the Siversk axis. As mentioned, 6 tanks, 3 APCs, 6 MTLBs, armoured recovery vehicle, 12 light vehicles, and 2 buggies and 41 motorcycles. But as Trent Telenko says, the thing that jumps out for me here is this force. Lists it all again. In 2025, this is considered massive compared to what we saw in February 2022. And there used to be sort of 60 fully armoured vehicles, APCs, IFVs and tanks. You'd have maybe 20 tanks and 20 IFVs and 20 APCs and whatnot, and that would be your massive attack. Now we've got a whole bunch of motorcycles and some turtle tanks and all sorts. So these photos from February 2022 show the scale of the Russian army armoured columns, how far the mighty have fallen. So there you go. This is a kind of attacking force that you would have once seen. Remember those big 40-kilometer or 60-kilometer, was it 40-mile maybe, columns where they are advancing on Kiev. Now, you're lucky to get 20 vehicles that aren't motorcycles. So this was a significant attack by the Russians, but it also shows that they have limited access to those armored vehicles. That said, the motorcycles are really quite useful for the Russians at being able to take land or get deep into the grey zone and possibly Ukrainian territory relatively quickly. Playfry here says, received some further clarifications. This is in response to, we were able to gather a little bit of further info about the Siversk attack you see quoted. This attack happened about 2 days ago, and as of yesterday, they were still mopping up some of the survivors. The Russians drove past Ukrainian positions and literally got lost. Virtually all the Russians died, but as said yesterday, they were still finishing off the survivors, so I'm not sure about the current situation. About the current contact line position, it's extremely disorganized there and almost impossible to clarify for sure. So the Russians took one hell of a beating, but it seems like they drove past the Ukrainian positions, got lost, and then got annihilated. Received some further clarifications. The Ukrainians knew about this attack in advance, so they prepared and met them very well. Interestingly, they were expecting an even bigger assault than this, so it made it a little bit easier to repel this assault. So I guess if you were prepared for a much bigger assault, so you brought even more forces to bear here, and it was slightly smaller, so that meant that they could more adequately deal with them. But it's nonetheless still very big. Also, the Ukrainian electronic warfare in Siversk is incredible. It forces the Russians to never get closer than 4 kilometers to the city. Basically, they can't go over the Kamianske area, which basically collapsed Russian recon in the area. And it was exactly because of this that the Ukrainians were able to see so deep into Russian-controlled territory and spot the assault almost halfway to Lysychansk. As of now, the Ukrainian recon freely hovers over big chunks of this direction. So that's really good news, and that could explain why the Russians have failed to make any gains in the last 6 days. But that's excellent news that such a large assault was not only repelled, but they really did annihilate most, if not all, of the Russians there. Right, then we come down to Chasiv Yar. No change in Chasiv Yar. Excellent news for the Ukrainians there. But it starts to get much more worrying as we come to Toretsk and Pokrovsk, okay? So, actually, something else to note here. And yes, so in the same area of Kamianske, this is the sort of thing I'll show you on the hits and losses video, but I thought I'd show this as well. I don't know if this is anything to do with the same attack, but here, and it could well be because you got a tank on tank, so the Ukrainians might have been meeting the Russians with some of their own armor here. Although this is only one tank on one tank, and I presume the Russian vehicle is a tank. Who knows? It's one of these turtle tanks, but it could well be anything that's underneath all of that armor. This gets met by a Ukrainian tank that drives to the front of it. And remember, if this is a tank, this turtle tank, then it probably doesn't have an active, operable turret. So let's have a look at this. You have that turtle tank over here, and you have a Ukrainian tank that comes up to this in front of it, and basically just leathers the turtle tank from up front and sends a shell. Yeah, I knew that. Oh, why is it not playing? It's sometimes so annoying. Anyway, Ukrainian tank comes up here, and then, as you can see, it's not very good resolution. You can see it here. It has a shot at the Russian vehicle, and then basically that's the end of that vehicle. It starts smoking. It still is moving a little bit after that hit, and I don't know what happens thereafter. But anyway, that's been geolocated to around that same Kamianske area. We are going to come further to the south now, and we're going to really come to, we're going to go past Toretsk, where things are definitely, challenging for the Ukrainians as the Russians are making these gains south of Toretsk. Well, not really south of Toretsk, actually. Toretsk is over here. It's sort of almost now to the west of Toretsk. and also around the Yablonivka area here along this front. They are encroaching upon the outskirts of Kostiantynivka to a degree. Well, not quite the outskirts, but they're making these gains. I don't know what the defenses are like around here, whether the Ukrainians have more established defenses, but it's worrying that the south and the east is looking more and more challenging for the Ukrainians there. But I don't have too much information. Most of the information coming out is about what's happening in Prokovsk. So first of all, you have the what's the best way of explaining what's going on here? So if I might do a little bit of drawing here, let's do that. What you have is, I'm going to draw this to make it just a little bit clearer for you. Coming from Kostiantynivka, in fact, if we can move this out the way. Coming from Kostiantynivka, you have the T0504 highway. That is super important. And you have all these roads that, I say all of these roads, they don't have many roads that they can really adequately resupply Prokovsk with. Prokovsk is getting absolutely hammered with all sorts, and the Russians are fighting now in Prokovsk to the south, and possibly even getting special forces groups into the middle. But we'll come to that. What the Russians are trying to do here is obviously come from the north, the northeast, and also from the south and from the southwest, piling in pretty much everywhere. So the Ukrainians really need to stop the Russians around here, this kind of area. And that's what they appear to have done to some degree. This has been particularly worrying, and it's been fighting over Razino here, Razino. And as you can see, some blue pins show that Ukrainians have fought back there. The Russians here getting across the river, fighting uphill. They've got well past that road that was previously kind of holding the Russians back to some degree. They were back down here, and then they did these motorcycle attacks up towards the northern part of this road, almost going in the direction of Kostiantynivka. That allowed them to get past the Ukrainian defenses. This is where motorcycles have been used quite effectively, and then it was all kind of a case of just taking continuous land, the Russians here, over successive days and weeks. So what do we have? The situation in Prokovsk front is obviously very difficult. This is going back to the 25th, that's 3 days ago. After several weeks of intense assaults, Russian forces have begun attempts to enter the city. According to the Ukrainian sources, Russian troops are chaotically trying to break into the city from all directions, making it increasingly difficult to hold them back, and this does include special forces. Info from the field says Playfra, the situation in Prokovsk remains bad. The Russians found weaknesses in the defense and are penetrating and exploiting that. Deep reconnaissance groups are still in the city, contrary to what some pro-Ukrainian reports state. And in Zaporizhzhia, in fact, this is what I said last time, or not last time, but the other day on my hits and losses videos. So they are trying to get in around this Troyanda area from the south. There are claims that actually they have purchase or presence, or have had presence all the way into this central part here. So there are different mapping interpretations of what's going on in the city or in the town. If we go to the north, though, to that Razino area, if you look up there, where the Ukrainians have had some success in countering. Big news, says End Strike, Ukrainian forces have liberated Razino. Located in the Milove direction of Donetsk Oblast, the advance came amid continued offensive actions by Ukraine along several front lines in the east. The liberation of Razino strengthens Ukrainian tactical positions west of the city of Donetsk City, potentially enabling further pressure on Russian defences in the region. I don't know that you can read too much into this. They've got an awful lot of work to do to keep the Russians away from Prokovsk. Ukrainian military sources report that the operation involved coordinated infantry maneuvers supported by artillery and drone reconnaissance. The village has previously been under Russian control and was used as a forward position for logistical and surveillance purposes. This gain adds to a series of localized successes for Ukraine, and this is coming from today, by the way, as it continues efforts to disrupt the Russian supply lines and push back occupation forces in Donetsk. So the idea is that from this pro-Ukrainian source that there have been some successes in pushing the Russians back, but it is pretty challenging there. As a result of successful counterattacks, says Vizioner, today the armed forces of Ukraine have liberated Razino. It appears the Ukrainian forces have committed reserves to the battle and launched active defense operations along the Prokovsk-Myrnarad line in order to push back Russian troops and neutralize the threat of potential encirclement. So good news there. And another image here to sort of suggest where that is and what's going on. But that is one localized area. Other people are showing how difficult it is there. Here is a source from yesterday, Ukrainian source. Meanwhile, the Russians continue their offensive, attempting to capture Rodinsk and encircle Pokrovsk-Myrnarad. At this point, we are no longer dealing with mere pressure, but with deliberate attempts to throw our defense into chaos. The enemy continues to push forward and with superior infantry numbers, whose task is not just to advance, but to increasingly fragment our defense and make it less dense. It's no longer just about pushing our forces out of their positions. The enemy is deliberately trying to push its infantry deeper in, wherever there's a chance to bypass our positions and infiltrate as far into the rear as possible. They take it. This creates a situation where fighting sometimes takes place beyond the front line during our turn movements, because we know the enemy may be our own movements, but may be encountered deep behind our positions. Aside from obvious risks of friendly fire, general confusion and heightened tension when everyone realizes the enemy could be hiding behind any bush or breach pilot and mortar positions, there's another broader issue. Resources are being reallocated from striking the enemy's front lines and first echelon to targeting their logistics, to monitoring our own zone, figuring out exactly who is moving through it, friend or foe. This diverts resources that are already scarce. For example, in a given brigade's area, a fire support group is moving through a friendly controlled settlement. They run into a small enemy unit and engage in combat. They eliminate one or two enemy fighters while the rest retreat and vanish at certain coordinates. Then aerial reconnaissance in that sector shifts its focus to hunting down the rest of that group instead of working on the front line as it should. Meanwhile, pressure continues to build. The enemy not only pushes head on and from the flanks to break through positions, but also creates constant tension in rear zones close to the zero line. While these small enemy groups try to survive and inflict damage, other units are consolidating in captured villages, forest strips and industrial sites and keep advancing. Roads that previously only saw foot traffic are now swarming with motorcycles and ATVs. Drone pilots and electronic warfare crews move in, and so the cycle repeats. This tactic aims to fragment the defense and facilitate further advancement. And as an aside for me, this is where quads, buggies and motorcycles are going to be super useful. These kind of urban areas that they can scoot along really quickly, and the Ukrainian drone teams, rather than focus on hitting the Russian logistics and the frontline troops around here, are now having to do reconnaissance over their own positions to work out who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. It's really, really challenging. The offensive has momentum. The enemy relies on infantry to carry it forward. Losses are compensated with reinforcements and fresh units, and this will continue as long as they're making progress and have resources. On the western bank of the Toretsk River, launching moto assaults in the area of Razino might still be problematic, but if the enemy manages to sufficiently expand their foothold and set up reliable crossings, it will become possible over time. So this is that river I was talking about up here around Razino, trying to get across this river and push uphill, but actually the Ukrainians have pushed back there, which is good news. So in some places, enemy troops are advancing through open fields and anti-tank ditches, where many end up lying, either dead or badly wounded. No bravado here. There are already areas where the number of dead enemy soldiers is significant. I've written before, it's clear the Russian command believes it can afford such losses to achieve its goals. Apparently, they'd rather sustain those losses now and keep moving daily than save their personnel and give them time to stabilize, potentially making further advances more difficult later. So what they're saying is that actually, rather than make serious, consolidated but smaller gains, they're throwing everything at Ukrainians now to try and get, movement on the map, but it may not be more sustainable later because actually they've made too many losses. So it's certainly an interesting interpretation. Sorry, I'm flipping around too much here. And from the other flank, Konstantinivka, is there something more at this stage? Perhaps I'll write separately about more speculative theories. So I don't know as much going on around Konstantinivka as Pokrovsk at the moment, but certainly very challenging in Prokovsk, and the map could look very different. Well, the grey zone map looks very different. In fact, if we go to Andrew Perpetua's map and we come out of where we were up in the north around Tetkino and come down to look at what's going on in Prokovsk, we will be able to get a sense of the sort of activity that's taking place there. So Russian airstrikes taking place in the south of Prokovsk, so that's good news. That means that the Ukrainians are still active around here. That's the 26th, that's the 27th. But there are claims that the Russians have had attacks, deep reconnaissance groups up into this area. But yeah, actually from Andrew's mapping, it looks like most everything has been Russian strikes on the city itself. But I'll be interested in his next update to see if there's any corroboration of the claims that the Russians have got deep into Prokovsk with their special forces. Okay, so that is broadly the Prokovsk area, and not too much change on the next part of the front line that comes down south until we get to the other main area. I don't know what area to call this now. So you kind of move past Bakhtir, and Bakhtir's all the way back there. The Russians making considerable gains right down this eastern front. I don't have too much to say about that. I don't know when they are going to meet the full-on Ukrainian defences, tank ditches and pre-prepared areas that were along much further back from, say, Velika Novosilka. But as you can see, Velika Novosilka, it seems to be a distant memory now as the Russians are pushing on and on. And then we come to the southern area. So no real change along the southern front line. Surrey Maps and Andrew Perpetua has some Russian gains as they push back in the Kamianske area. This was an area where the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back in this neck of the woods. It could be that the Russians have then subsequently countered there. But actually, there's been a lot of talk about Russians amassing troops in the Zaporizhzhia area, and this being somewhere where they are planning on attacking. The Ukrainians have been hitting logistics around here, train lines and everything, I think, to try and stop the Russians from mounting a significant offensive on the Zaporizhzhia front line. What do we have in some of these sources? War translators saying heavy Russian armour, including tanks and air defence, is being moved towards the Prokovsk and Zaporizhzhia axes, so both of those axes, on a scale not seen in a long time. Main supply routes run through Uspenka and Voznesenka, reports Petro Andriushchenko, advisor to the Mariupol mayor. So he's claiming that there are quite considerable Russian troops moving through these areas. We had heard that previously from Andriushchenko as well, so it's not hugely unusual. We also hear that Ukrainian forces have made a new advance south of Zaporizhzhia as a result of carefully planned assault operations. The 1st Assault Battalion of the 210th Separate Assault Regiment advanced in the area of Kamianske, but that, although that came from yesterday, the claims from both the mappers is that actually the Russians have advanced in Kamianske. So maybe it's pretty dynamic around there. What else do we have? Malatokmak in the Orikhiv direction. Malatokmachka. We have, where are you? Here we go. Malatokmachka. The really big difference of opinion between the two mappers here, with Andrew Perpetua's the Russian defensive line much further to the south. Surrey Maps is much more charitable to the Russians, having them actually in control of a considerable area of Malatokmachka, but not so according to Andrew Perpetua. And this claim is that the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians out of part of that area further to the east. So we'll have to see if the mappers that we synthesize change their mapping to reflect that in any way. And then near Kamianske, where we were just talking about, Zaporizhzhia region, a Ukrainian SSR unit discovered and destroyed a large Russian ammunition depot inside a warehouse. Detonation still reportedly taking place. So there's a lot of activity around Kamianske. There could be more activity from the Russians right along this front, as there are these rumors that they could be attacking in the Zaporizhzhia region, but they might just try and pile into Kamianske in an attempt to move up the reservoir as it was and get towards Zaporizhzhia to get within striking distance of Zaporizhzhia, hit it with MLRS and artillery and whatnot. But that's a tall order. I think they'd find that somewhat difficult, but it depends how many troops and pieces of equipment they have amassed. Anyway, that's enough from me. Hopefully that was of use. A bit of a rush job. I do apologise. But you know, it looks like dinner's on the table, so I better get going. I really appreciate your support. Let me know what you think, and if you have any extra information about what's going on the front lines, put it in the thread below. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.